Thanks very much, and I'd like to echo what was said a minute ago, but it's been a really interesting and enjoyable 2 days, and fair play to you all for your commitment. You know, you're a very serious bunch of people. So what I'm going to do is not a formal summary. As Liam has said, the staff and the Biodiversity Centre and Sinead and others will be doing that in terms of trying to sum up from the table. So it's more what I call impressions. So a quick recap. And the first thing that struck me was a lot of people use this approach, like Hans earlier on, challenges and opportunities. So running through, obviously, the 2 days, these kind of challenges are coming out. The mindset of local authority staff is very much engineering and development led. I think a lot of you who work in local authorities recognise that. And so the challenge, therefore, is to adapt and change that mindset. We heard a lot about mindset change. The pressures on scarce resources within the local authorities are massive, particularly in terms of building 300,000 houses, etc., all the various pressures. So biodiversity is competing then for scarce resources, for airtime, for support. There is a reliance on what I call heroes, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, but kind of the famous thing of Cuchulainn in the Gap, you know, minding Ulster and so on. People who were working mostly as individuals in the local authority structures around the country, the heritage officers, the biodiversity officers, in some cases environment awareness officers, but without teams, without support, without structures in many cases. Fantastic work, but I don't think that you can build a future system in terms of where we want to be in the country just on that kind of, it's a particular form of management by heroes, but it's not sustainable. And similarly then the reliance on willing volunteers. I was at a very interesting table with some fantastic ladies, some of them are involved in tidy towns in various parts of the country, and this idea that when there's something to be done and the state has decided it will be done, and then you go to the community, sure, we'll get the tidy towns to do that. And sometimes, and we got that conversation, it's not always possible for people to have that capacity. But we have relied, and it's been fantastic to some extent, but it is a challenge. Patchy structures for data and for communications. Heard a lot about that, and that's a great opportunity as well. We'll come to opportunities in a minute for Liam and for his colleagues. But the data holdings within the local authorities, I heard several people talking about it, that roads have all sorts of information about what they have done in relation to biodiversity and so on, which is held in one place, and then other parts of the local authority have different bits of information or have done projects, but there isn't a system for holding and managing and particularly sharing that information. And then similarly, patchy structures. The kind of communication that's been going on here for the last 2 days, fantastic, but there hasn't been a forum enough for that. A say-do gap, and we heard about that from a number of people, including Mairead yesterday, the lady from Musgraves, and others, whether it be state agencies or local authorities or communities or individuals, what we say and what we do, this massive gap. We're very conscious of that. And finally, the challenge of visibility. I mean by that in 2 ways. First of all, visibility within the local authority structure of biodiversity. It is not as visible as it needs to be. And then secondly, it was mentioned this morning, I think it was Bernadette was talking about it, the idea that biodiversity itself as a topic is not as visible. If it is a crisis, as Hans said, why don't we act like it's a crisis? Compared to the pressures that are coming from the climate agenda and so on like that, it isn't as visible. But I would also say, actually, I've been at a few of these national biodiversity conferences for the last few years. One was held in February 2019, one was held this year in May. The local authority actual body of, I would call it expertise, the 25,000 people, were not as visible as you could have been. And I think there is, again, a reliance on the Shirley Clerkins and so on and so forth, a few of the people who are the heroes, but not enough. And so the senior voices, the senior people that are in the local authorities have to buy into this more and make it visible. So there are some challenges that were coming through the conversations. On the other hand, fantastic opportunities. I'm referring back in particular to Liam's opening talk, setting the scene yesterday, and to Malcolm Noonan this morning, and others. But if you think of these policies, Andy Bleasdale talked about European biodiversity policy, a new nature directive coming on stream this year with massive requirements for Ireland Inc. The river basin plans will be also talking about climate and talking about nature, the new common agricultural policy. So you have a huge suite of policies which is we'll come back to this later on, this idea of structures. That's driving a particular form of activity in the country. New revitalised partner in Parks and Wildlife. I was delighted to hear Andy talking about the way the new executive agency is beginning to work. Malcolm said today it's going to take time, but they are getting their act together as an organisation, which is fantastic. There's 400 great people working there. Hasn't been a very effective structure. Needs to be, like the EPA and other parts of environmental work, at the heart as a coordinator in Ireland. And that's beginning to happen. New structure for the Biodiversity Data Centre was mentioned. That's badly needed, and to provide that stability and long-term time horizon. Community sponsors that we heard from Denise Charlton, we heard from Musgrave. Again, these are new players that are on the pitch. The 10 biodiversity officers coming this year and more next year. Place-based learning, this idea of places and people, 1,000 communities. We believe in communities in Ireland. We're part of this old tribal thing, the tuas. It goes back 2,000 years. So I think there are opportunities there, huge opportunities. COVID accentuated that. And finally, then this idea of process. The process, again, from policy to hierarchy, national, local plans. We heard about that from Owen Douglas and various people. So I think that the potential opportunities are really strong in this area at a time, you know, I didn't even mention Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity, where there's a lot of forces coming together. If you were in a pub with the Taoiseach in the next couple of months while he's still Taoiseach, and you have a chat to him about biodiversity, he'll pull out his phone, he'll start talking about his collection of butterflies. Everywhere he goes in the country, he's taking pictures of butterflies. He's actually serious about biodiversity. So I think there are opportunities, and we need to take those opportunities now. So the actions from this conference are coming at a good time. Just going through then the 4 headings. Biodiversity and infrastructure. Again, these are reflections, thoughts, not a formal summary. But I was kind of surprised that the first few words that came out at me weren't about hard engineering topics as such. Inspiration, work with local imagination. Andy Bleasdale was talking about that. And the opening councillor yesterday said the same thing, be bold. Identify your priority actions. We heard about that from a number of people, including the lady who talked to us, Stephanie from Manchester. Indicators for a green city. Most of us, I think, would really say that Greta from Utrecht was kind of, I would call it a keynote in terms of setting the standard. One of the many lessons there was this idea of you put in the indicators in order to actually set standards, the amount of space, green space per household or whatever it might be. And if you don't have these indicators, then the infrastructure won't follow the way you want it to go. And then inventories, again, Andy Bleasdale was talking about that, which is about data. But you need that as a first step in terms of where you're going. And don't design in isolation. That word about working in isolation as opposed to working in teams, that was a recurring theme through the thing. The session about community was a great session, really good insights from everybody there. This is a guy from the Tidy Towns in Cong that we had some tours of the town with last week. It's just one of the examples of community around the country. Una and others talked about collective efforts. And clear, simple messages, you know, don't mow it, let it go. All the kind of work that we've heard in terms of clear messages. Cups of coffee, Amanda and various people talked about it. The value of bringing people into a room and giving them coffee, like we're doing here, the communication that works from that. Not enough of those structures have been there. I think they're beginning to come. Closing the knowledge gaps. A lot of reference to knowledge gaps where, whether it be Susan Vickers today or many others, there is patchy information again about what we need to do at a community level, how best to do it, the best practice. There is a gap there, has yet to be closed. A lot of work is being done, not enough. And then this question came out yesterday. I thought it was a very interesting topic. Centre of Excellence linked to the Biodiversity Data Centre on actions or guidance or practice. That was mentioned in the community topic. And I think this emerged as one of the recommendations again. Those sort of centres of excellence are needed, working collectively along with the local authorities, maybe with the regional assemblies and so on. Biodiversity and climate action. An interesting session today. One of the first things that came out from Kevin Motherway was risk. This idea of the flooding risk, we heard it again a little while ago, coastal erosion, droughts. The world is changing, and we have to adapt to that from a biodiversity point of view. Lots of new resources coming onto the pitch at the local authority level, probably new teams, new programs, lots of new funding. How will they work? How will those carrows integrate with the other people working in the environmental space, or will they build their own empire? You know, this is what happens in organizations. So the challenge of bringing those teams together. New players, again, like the Rivers Trust that Liz Gabbett was talking about, and others. A fantastic opportunity, but those structures need to be supported. Roadmaps. The idea, again, is part of this process overall of planning and designing, developing roadmaps in Strabane. Christine gave a lovely talk about that, what they were doing for pollinators. And again, Shirley, the roadmaps, long, slow, patient work that was done in Monaghan on the wetlands. And finally, very much part of the language now is restoration. So there's a new nature restoration directive coming along. Ireland is not ready for it. There'll be very ambitious targets, but it will be part of the language from now on for local authorities to be in this space of working with people who are going to restore habitats and helping to make sure that if it's supposed to be restored, that it actually happens. Wetlands, seagrasses, the various ones we heard from Bernadette today. And then finally, biodiversity and management. And just very briefly, it's a kind of an interesting question, what is management? Because the topics that you talked about through the whole 2 days really were about management in a way. Management is a very simple kind of idea. It's about getting people to do things. You can go to Harvard Business School for 2 years and spend €100,000, or, you know, figure it out for yourself. You don't have to do that. It's a very simple idea, but it's not so simple to do it. It's dynamic, it's continuous, it's goal-focused, and so on. But this idea of you set a goal, and then you organize other people. It's a group thing, it's not an individual thing. So biodiversity and management, I am impressed, having worked for 40 years in the Irish public and private sector, at the way in which management structures are coming into creation, into being, slowly, but they're happening. But the first thing is you have to put in biodiversity at the top in terms of European and national priorities and county priorities. National and regional objectives, we heard about that happening. I was delighted. I think that we need more from the regional assemblies, and that be promoted more than it is. Again, then that leads to the county development plans, and finally for guidelines. But with those kind of management structures, we've seen in the water space, I've worked in that for many years, how that rigor of national and local structures and groups working together is bringing a sense of direction, what I would call it a sense of order, which county councils like. We're getting it in the climate area. It has been loose in the biodiversity area. There hasn't been enough of those formal management structures, but we heard lots of examples over the last few days, and I think that's a very powerful, to my mind, platform for the work that's going to be done. So the last slide is just looking at Biodiverse Ireland 2040. I picked 2040 because Owen and others talked about the National Development Plan, and just would make a reference to a document which is called Ireland at Another Turning Point from Futures Ireland. It's from the last recession, 2008, 2009, the last one before this one that's probably going to come our way. But basically it looked at how Ireland learns. And it was 200 people from across the public and private and community and voluntary sector. And the gist of it was, we learn at a local level very well. We learn at a community level. We learn at county council. There's great praise in it for local authorities. We're pretty screwed up in terms of learning at a national level. They were quite critical how slow there is, you know, to change or to learn or to adapt at a national level. There are exceptions to that, but by and large, they were saying we need new forms of community involvement whereby the state works with local structures in all sorts of different areas. And I think biodiversity is an example. So new structures, new forms of involvement with communities, with schools, with shops, with tourism, working together with local authorities. We heard a lot about that, but I think we're only at the start of that evolution. So that was my take on it. I'm happy to work with Liam and the colleagues on the more formal part of it. But just to congratulate Una Fitzpatrick and Liam and Sinead and the folks from Limerick here. Well done on organising the conference, and thank you all. Gur míle maith, slán